At first, it was reported as a routine incident, another contained explosion, another vague statement, another denial meant to fade into the noise of war. But then the data appeared. Seismic readings, thermal spikes, satellite frames that refused to line up with the official story. What looked like a minor strike was something else entirely. Something buried deep, ignited from within, and powerful enough to shake the ground itself. This wasn't just an attack that destroyed a target. It exposed a failure no one believed was possible until the footage emerged. The strike reframed diplomacy from a mechanism of restraint into a trigger for action, marking a fundamental shift in how negotiations function in modern warfare. The failed Geneva ceasefire was not interpreted in Kyiv as a temporary diplomatic impasse or a bargaining tactic, but as a definitive signal that the window for prevention had closed. Rather than viewing Russia's rejection as political theater aimed at leverage, Ukrainian planners treated it as confirmation of imminent kinetic intent. In this framework, diplomacy no longer buys time, it clarifies timelines. The moment Russia refused even a narrowly scoped humanitarian pause, the ambiguity surrounding its next move disappeared. From Ukraine's perspective, a state preparing dozens of ballistic missiles while rejecting a 72-hour ceasefire was not posturing, it was aligning conditions for immediate escalation. This logic transformed negotiations into a binary decision point. Acceptance would have implied at least short-term de-escalation and dispersion risk for Russian missile assets. Rejection, by contrast, validated the intelligence picture of an impending strike campaign and made delay strategically irrational. Waiting would not have preserved stability. It would have increased Ukraine's exposure by allowing missiles to be dispersed, hardened, or launched first. In that sense, diplomacy ceased to be a brake and became a sensor, one that confirmed hostile intent faster than any satellite image could. The broader implication is doctrinal. Ukraine demonstrated that it now integrates diplomatic outcomes directly into operational planning cycles, treating them as actionable inputs rather than parallel political processes. This represents a move away from the Cold War assumption that talks slow wars down. Instead, negotiations can now accelerate preemption by collapsing uncertainty. Once intent is clear, speed becomes the dominant variable. The strike that followed was therefore not a breakdown of diplomacy, but its logical continuation by other means. In this emerging model of conflict, refusing diplomacy does not freeze the battlefield, it activates it, turning words not into pauses, but into triggers with immediate and irreversible consequences. What made this operation truly disruptive was not the drones themselves, but the way intelligence erased Russia's traditional margin of warning. For decades, strategic depth and early warning had been the quiet advantages of missile-heavy powers, buying time to disperse assets, elevate readiness, or preempt retaliation. In this case, that advantage collapsed. By fusing satellite imagery, thermal signatures, electronic indicators, and real-time intelligence from European partners, Ukraine compressed the entire detection-to-decision cycle into hours, not days. The result was a form of operational clarity that left no space for Russian missile survivability doctrine to function as intended. The buildup at the storage complex was identified not as a vague threat, but as a time-sensitive vulnerability that would only exist briefly. Crucially, the strike came before Russia could execute its standard playbook: dispersal, camouflage, and activation. Those doctrines assume that warning time still exists, that detection precedes action by a meaningful margin. Ukraine inverted that assumption. Instead of waiting for missiles to become operational and then responding, planners acted while the systems were still dependent on centralized storage, support vehicles, and predictable infrastructure. In doing so, they shifted the logic of modern strike warfare from detect and respond to detect and deny activation. The objective was no longer to intercept missiles in flight or retaliate after impact, but to prevent the moment of launch from ever occurring. This approach raises uncomfortable questions. Some will view it as a dangerous compression of decision-making, one that risks escalation by reducing diplomatic and military buffers. Others may argue that in an environment where missiles can reach cities in minutes, warning time itself has become an illusion, and that acting earlier is the only rational option left. What is clear is that intelligence fusion has moved from a supporting role to a decisive one, capable of neutralizing entire strike architectures before they come alive. Whether this represents strategic foresight or a destabilizing precedent is open to debate, and viewers are invited to share their thoughts in the comments below. The destruction of the Junkoy complex revealed a paradox at the heart of hardened military infrastructure. It did not fail because it was poorly built, but because it was built too narrowly for an older threat model. Russian engineers designed the facility to survive direct external attack. Thick concrete, buried chambers, blast-resistant doors, and layered protection meant to absorb or deflect explosions from the outside. Against traditional airstrikes or cruise missile impacts, this approach made sense. What it did not account for was a breach that turned the bunker's own internal systems into force multipliers for destruction. Once the perimeter was compromised, the very features meant to preserve the site became conduits for catastrophic failure. Ventilation shafts, access tunnels, and internal transfer corridors were engineered for efficiency, safety, and sustainment under siege conditions. In practice, they became attack vectors. When fire entered the tunnel network, it behaved less like a localized explosion and more like a pressurized furnace, channeling heat, flame, and overpressure deep into the complex. The design emphasized blast resistance, but lacked sufficient compartmentalization and fire break mechanisms to prevent internal propagation. As a result, energy that would have dissipated in open air was instead trapped, amplified, and redirected inward. This is where over-optimization becomes fragility. The bunker assumed that any penetration would be shallow or survivable, not systemic. Redundancy was built around keeping the facility operational after impact, not around preventing cascading internal failure. Once ignition reached stored propellants and missile boosters, the bunker transformed from a protective shell into a sealed pressure vessel. Strength became confinement, and confinement became lethality. The lesson is not that hardened bunkers are obsolete, but that their design logic lags behind the realities of precision, low-cost, asymmetric attack. Protection against penetration is no longer enough if internal systems cannot absorb failure gracefully. In Junkoi, resilience existed only as long as the structure remained intact. The moment it was breached, the fortress revealed itself to be false, not because it lacked strength, but because it lacked adaptability to a new kind of threat. What made the drone swarm effective was not its size or firepower, but its manipulation of time. The attack demonstrated that in modern air defense warfare, seconds can matter more than explosives. A radar blackout lasting just 22 seconds would appear insignificant by traditional tactical standards, yet it proved operationally decisive. That brief window was enough to allow an entire formation of low-flying drones to pass through undetected, reshaping the engagement before Russian operators could even re-establish situational awareness. The strike did not aim to destroy the air defense network outright. It aimed to desynchronize it. Russian air defenses failed not because they were overwhelmed numerically, but because they were overloaded temporally. Systems designed to track, classify, and intercept targets in orderly sequences were forced into a chaotic rhythm they could not sustain. Rapid launches, constant retasking, and manual overrides compressed decision cycles beyond human and technical limits. Interceptors fired too quickly, radars overheated, and command nodes lost the ability to prioritize. In this environment, even intact systems became functionally useless. The collapse was not physical, but chronological. This is where the concept of swarm warfare shifts. Instead of saturating defenses with sheer numbers, the drones saturated time itself. Each maneuver, altitude change, and staggered arrival was calibrated to disrupt the defender's internal tempo. The objective was not to exhaust missile stocks, but to fracture continuity, forcing air defense operators to react faster than their systems were designed to allow. Once that rhythm broke, gaps appeared not in space, but in sequence, and those gaps were exploited immediately. The implication is profound. Defensive architectures have long been built around spatial coverage and intercept capacity. This attack showed that control of time reaction delays, processing bottlenecks, and recovery intervals can be just as decisive. By turning fleeting moments into decisive vulnerabilities, the drone swarm redefined what saturation means. It was not a flood of targets, but a collapse of timing, proving that in contemporary conflict, winning the clock can matter more than winning the sky. One of the most revealing aspects of the engagement was that Russian air defenses were not primarily defeated by Ukrainian firepower, but by their own internal limits under stress. The systems functioned as designed right up until the pace of the attack exceeded the conditions they were built to endure. Interceptors were launched at such a rapid rate that thermal thresholds were crossed, forcing automated shutdowns without a single launcher being physically destroyed. In effect, the defense neutralized itself. This was not a failure of technology in isolation, but a failure of assumptions about how that technology would be used in combat. As the situation deteriorated, operators were forced into manual engagement modes. On paper, this is a safeguard meant to preserve control when automation falters. In practice, it stripped the system of its greatest advantage: precision under complexity. Against low-altitude, fast-moving UAVs weaving through cluttered terrain, manual targeting reduced accuracy to near irrelevance. Reaction times lagged, tracking quality collapsed, and intercepts became probabilistic at best. What remained was the appearance of defense without its substance. This exposes a deeper structural flaw in high-end air defense doctrine. These systems are optimized for peak performance within a narrow operational envelope, but they degrade sharply once pushed beyond it. There is little in the way of graceful failure. Instead of scaling down effectiveness in a controlled manner, they tip abruptly from precision to dysfunction. Under swarm pressure, the transition is not gradual, it is sudden and unforgiving. There is no single correct interpretation here. Some professionals may see this as an unavoidable consequence of pushing any system to its limits, while others might argue it reflects a doctrinal over-reliance on automation without sufficient resilience built in. What is clear is that stress, not destruction, was the decisive factor. The air defenses did not collapse because they were weak, but because they were brittle in ways that only this kind of attack could reveal. What ultimately destroyed the missile complex was not the drones themselves, but the energy already stored inside it. The UAVs functioned less as conventional weapons and more as ignition tools, designed to unlock the destructive potential of the target's own contents. Once the first breach allowed fire to reach missile propellants and booster sections, the physics of the strike changed completely. Ukraine was no longer delivering explosive force, it was releasing it. The stored chemical energy inside the facility did the real work, turning a protected stockpile into a self-consuming blast engine. This approach radically altered the cost equation. A relatively small number of low-cost drones initiated a chain reaction that destroyed assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The imbalance was not incremental, it was exponential. Each missile lost represented not just a single weapon, but the cumulative investment of manufacturing, logistics, transport, and maintenance under sanction-constrained conditions. By exploiting what was already present, Ukraine achieved effects that would have been impossible through direct fire alone. The strike demonstrated that in modern conflict, the most powerful weapon may be the enemy's own inventory when it is forced to detonate out of sequence and out of control. The implications extend far beyond this single site. Logistics stockpiles are traditionally treated as strategic buffers, meant to absorb losses and sustain operations over time. This attack inverted that logic. Concentration, once a strength, became a vulnerability. Storage safety assumptions collapsed the moment precision access was achieved. Rather than representing resilience, the accumulation of munitions created a latent liability, one that could be triggered by minimal external force, but produce catastrophic internal consequences. In this context, survivability is no longer about how well a facility resists attack, but about how safely it fails once breached. The strike at the missile depot showed that destruction does not always require overwhelming firepower. Sometimes it only requires the right spark in the right place, turning reserves into accelerants and logistics into the decisive weapon against itself. One of the most decisive outcomes of the strike was not the explosion itself, but the evidence it produced. In this case, physics rendered denial impossible. Seismic readings, registering measurable tremors and thermal spikes, exceeding instrument limits, created an independent record of what occurred beneath the surface. Unlike satellite imagery, which can be delayed, obscured, or disputed, geophysical data speaks in absolutes. Heat signatures do not conform to narratives, and ground vibrations cannot be edited after the fact. Together, they formed a body of proof that existed outside politics, messaging, or information control. This mattered because modern conflict is fought as much in perception as in physical space. Russia's initial attempts to downplay or deny losses quickly collided with data from international monitoring stations that had no stake in the narrative. Seismographs recorded sequential underground detonations, inconsistent with accidents or isolated fires. Thermal sensors captured sustained heat far beyond what conventional fuel or structural damage could produce. These indicators collectively confirmed not just damage, but catastrophic internal failure. Once released into the analytical ecosystem, they forced acknowledgement without requiring official admission. The strike highlighted a shift in how battle damage is assessed and understood. Traditional methods relied heavily on visual confirmation, crater analysis, destroyed vehicles, or intercepted communications. While still relevant, Those tools are now supplemented by geophysical evidence that reveals what imagery cannot: internal collapse, chain reactions, and subsurface destruction. Underground facilities, once designed to conceal damage, now betray themselves through heat and seismic signatures that are globally observable. In effect, the attack bypassed information warfare entirely. It left behind a trail of physical facts that could not be reframed or plausibly denied, only contextualized after the damage was already acknowledged. This represents a new constraint on secrecy in modern warfare. When destruction alters the environment itself, denial becomes a temporary posture at best. The battlefield no longer ends at the surface, and neither does the evidence that defines strategic reality. The true cost of the strike was not measured by the number of missiles destroyed, but by the collapse of the system that made those missiles usable. Firepower can be counted, replaced, and eventually rebuilt. Operational continuity cannot. The destruction of transport erector launchers, command and control vehicles, climate stabilization units, and specialized support equipment severed the connective tissue of the missile force. Without these components, even surviving munitions became inert assets present, but unusable. The loss reshaped the missile network from a functioning system into a collection of disconnected parts. Support infrastructure is often overlooked because it does not explode as visibly as weapons do. Yet it is precisely these elements that determine whether firepower can be regenerated, redeployed, and synchronized. Climate control units preserve missile integrity. TELs provide mobility and launch readiness. And command vehicles integrate targeting data and authorization. Their destruction imposed a bottleneck far more severe than the loss of individual missiles. Regeneration was no longer a matter of inventory, but of rebuilding an ecosystem. Sanctions magnified this effect. Replacement timelines stretched from weeks into months, not due to engineering complexity alone, but because supply chains were fragmented and specialized components difficult to source. Even where industrial capacity existed on paper, throughput could not match operational demand. The result was a form of strategic paralysis, a force that appeared intact numerically but could not be brought back online at speed. What Russia lost, therefore, was not just hardware, but rhythm. Missile operations depend on tempo, how quickly assets can be moved, readied, and integrated into strike plans. That tempo was broken. The strike exposed how modern military power hinges less on headline weapons than on the fragile systems that enable them. When those systems fail, firepower becomes symbolic rather than functional, and recovery is measured not in replacement counts, but in time lost and opportunities missed. The most enduring impact of the strike may lie not in the physical damage it inflicted, but in the psychological rupture it created within the defensive force itself. Military systems do not operate on hardware alone. They depend on confidence, predictability, and the belief that certain spaces are secure. That belief was shattered. Reports of hurried evacuations, disorganized movement, and intercepted communications, marked by disbelief and despair, point to more than momentary confusion. They suggest a collapse in internal certainty, a realization that long-held assumptions about safety and control no longer applied. For years, Crimea had been framed internally as a hardened sanctuary, protected by layered air defenses and distance from the front. That perception shaped behavior, readiness, and risk tolerance. Once it failed, the damage extended far beyond the immediate site. Personnel who believe their positions are invulnerable behave differently from those who know they are exposed. After the strike, every alarm carried new weight. Every radar contact felt more threatening, and every quiet moment became suspect. This kind of psychological stress erodes performance before any follow-on attack is launched. The disruption of belief systems is especially corrosive because it cannot be repaired quickly. Hardware can be replaced, and command structures can be reissued orders, but confidence rebuilds slowly and unevenly. Defensive forces under constant doubt tend to overreact, misallocate resources, and exhaust themselves chasing perceived threats. In that sense, the strike imposed a lasting tax on future defensive effectiveness, one that compounds over time rather than dissipating. What occurred was not simply the exposure of a physical vulnerability, but the internal acknowledgement of it. The myth of Crimean invulnerability was broken from the inside, where it mattered most. If you value objective analysis over speculation and rumor, consider following this channel. We focus on how decisions are made and the changes those decisions set in motion. The strike marked a clear inversion of strategic initiative, demonstrating that escalation control does not require expansion of the battlefield. Ukraine achieved a decisive reduction in Russia's Crimean strike capacity, estimated at roughly 60%, without widening the war geographically or triggering immediate horizontal escalation. This was not escalation through volume, but through precision and selectivity. By choosing a target that directly shaped Russia's ability to project force, Ukraine dictated the terms of engagement rather than reacting to them. For much of the conflict, Ukraine operated within a reactive framework, focused on intercepting attacks, absorbing pressure, and responding after damage had already occurred. This operation signaled a departure from that posture. Instead of waiting for missiles to be launched and then defending against them, Ukraine struck the architecture that made those launches possible. The initiative shifted from defending against outcomes to shaping conditions. In doing so, Ukraine forced Russia into a compensatory posture, rerouting assets, redistributing air defenses, and expending efforts simply to restore a fraction of lost capability. More importantly, the strike established a precedent that challenges traditional attrition-based thinking. Rather than grinding down forces incrementally, Ukraine demonstrated the effectiveness of denying sanctuary altogether. Safe zones, once assumed to exist by virtue of distance or layered defenses, were revealed as conditional and temporary. The logic of war moved away from wearing the enemy down over time and toward selectively dismantling the systems that enable sustained operations. This approach alters escalation dynamics in subtle but profound ways. By striking deep without expanding outward, Ukraine increased strategic pressure while limiting immediate pathways for retaliation. The message was implicit but unmistakable. Depth no longer guarantees security, and restraint does not imply passivity. In that sense, the initiative did not merely change hands, it changed character. Control of the conflict shifted toward those who can identify, reach, and neutralize critical nodes, redefining what dominance looks like in a modern war. When you step back from the battlefield details, the deeper lesson is not really about drones, missiles, or even war. It is about how change actually happens. What failed in this story was not strength, but assumption. Systems that looked solid collapsed because they were built for yesterday's risks, not today's realities. That lesson applies far beyond conflict. In careers, families, businesses, and health, we often protect what once worked instead of preparing for what is coming next. Another quiet message is the value of timing and awareness. Ukraine did not act with more force, it acted with better understanding and at the right moment. In life, many decisive outcomes are shaped the same way. Acting early, based on clear information, often matters more than reacting strongly after problems have already taken root. Waiting for certainty can sometimes be the most dangerous choice. There is also a reminder about resilience. True resilience is not about being unbreakable. It is about how gracefully we adapt when something does break. Those who rely entirely on a single source of security, whether a system, a routine, or a belief, are often the most vulnerable when conditions change. Flexibility, humility, and continuous learning are what sustain us over time. For those with years of experience behind them, this story reinforces something you already know. Progress favors those who question assumptions, stay mentally agile, and understand that stability is never permanent. The world keeps changing, and the quiet advantage belongs to those who notice early, adjust calmly, and act with purpose rather than panic.